I'm Amanda Robertson, 38, and I clawed my way from a working-class home in Abilene, Texas, to becoming a commander in the United States Navy. For years, I helped carry my younger brother Mateo's life quietly, sending money, showing up when I could, and sacrificing pieces of my own life without asking for thanks. But when he kept reducing everything I had built to just, she's in the Navy, and treated me like a stranger in his world, I finally had to face the truth. Have you ever given everything to someone only to be overlooked, dismissed, or made invisible? If you have, tell me your story in the comments because you're not alone. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up after being underestimated by someone you loved, hit the like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, family, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next changed everything. My mother, Diane Robertson, née Garza, worked doubles at a diner on Cedar Street for most of my childhood. She was a small woman with large hands and the kind of exhaustion that doesn't read as dramatic because it never fully lifts. She loved us. I want to be clear about that first and before anything else. She was present in every way that mattered. More than could be said for my father, Ray Robertson, who was present in all the ways that didn't. Mateo was born in 1992. I was 5. My mother told me I sat in the corner and studied him for a long time before I agreed to hold him. I believe it. I was always the kind of person who assessed a situation before committing. What I remember is the summer of 1997. Mateo was 5 years old and I was 10, and the street in front of our house had a slight downhill tilt to it that was useful for building momentum. I ran alongside him for 2 full afternoons, my hand on the back of his bicycle seat, before he made it the length of the block without grabbing the brakes. When he realized I'd let go, when he understood that he was doing it on his own, he made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a laugh. Both, in sequence, very fast. He wobbled to a stop at the bottom of the block and turned around to look at me with an expression that contained something I recognized, even at 10, as wonder. I made a note of it. That was the first time I understood what it was for, not the bike riding specifically, but the whole category of thing that the bike riding represented. The showing up, the running alongside, the knowing when to let go. That's what it was for. Our father, Ray, was still around in 1997. He worked construction on and off, drank more than he worked in the later years, and had a temper that arrived without useful warning. I will not spend more time on Ray Robertson than the story requires. He left in 1999, the year I turned 12 and Mateo turned 7, and what he left behind was not a tragedy so much as a clarification. The house got easier to manage once the variable had removed itself. What he left behind was a family of 3, my mother working 2 jobs, a 7-year-old who needed somebody steady, and me, who had already, without being asked, decided that steady was what I would be. The years between 12 and 18 are not dramatic in the way people expect. There was no single defining moment, just the accumulation of it. I picked Mateo up from school on the days my mother couldn't. I checked his homework, called his teachers when he fell behind. I worked weekends at a gas station on Industrial Boulevard from 15, and the money went toward a savings account I was keeping toward something I hadn't named yet, and whatever Mateo needed that month. A field trip fee, new shoes, the kind of small thing that only seems small to people who have enough. I never resented him. That's the part people don't believe when I tell this story. Mateo needed somebody, and I was there. That wasn't a burden. That was the one thing I was certain I was doing right. The idea of the Navy came to me not as inspiration, but as logic. I had thought about college. I had run the scholarship numbers at the public library on my lunch breaks. The math didn't work unless someone paid for it, and no one was positioned to pay for it. The Navy would. More than that, the Navy offered a structure that would hold a world where competence was the primary currency and the work had real consequences. I could not imagine wanting more than that. The recruiting office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a dollar store on the east side of town. I walked in alone on a Tuesday morning in June of 2005, the week after I graduated high school. The recruiter, Petty Officer, First Class Hernandez, asked me what I was looking for. I told him I wanted something that would last. He went through the pathways. When he got to the intelligence specialist pipeline, I stopped him and said, "That one." I drove home in my mother's car and sat on the edge of Mateo's bed that evening and told him what I'd done. He was 13. He looked at me with the expression he wore when he was processing something larger than his current frame. Eyes slightly unfocused, mouth not quite closed, and he said, "You're leaving?" "I'll be back," I said, and I'll send money." "I don't care about money," he said. "I know," I said, "but you'll be glad it's there." I didn't join for glory. I joined because it was the only door that was open, and I was tired of waiting for someone to unlock a different one. Boot camp was in Great Lakes, Illinois. A school was in Pensacola, Florida. The intelligence specialist pipeline took me from Seaman Recruit, E1, through basic and advanced training, and by the time I finished in 2006 and advanced to Seaman, E3, I had understood something about myself that I hadn't fully known before. I was not just good at this work. I was built for it. The precision required, the pattern recognition under pressure, the ability to hold multiple threads simultaneously and draw the correct operational conclusion. All of it came naturally, and all of it was recognized by the people whose job it was to recognize it. My first deployment was in 2007 aboard USS Carl Vinson, CVN-70, operating in the Western Pacific. I was 20 years old, a petty officer, 3rd class, E4, and I was doing consequential work for the first time. Real work, in the sense that it mattered beyond my own participation in it. The intelligence products I contributed to fed into operational planning that affected real decisions made by real people in real situations. I understood that this was the beginning of something. I came home on leave and sat at the dinner table across from Mateo, who was 15 and had grown 3 inches and developed opinions about everything. He looked at me across the pot roast my mother had made and said quietly, almost to himself, "You look like you could arrest somebody." He wasn't wrong, I just didn't know how to turn it off at the dinner table yet. The gap between us started there, I think. Not dramatically, factually. He didn't have a frame of reference for what I was doing, and I didn't know how to build one for him in the length of a leave period. I sent him $200 in a card when I went back. He didn't thank me. I didn't wait for it. It became a pattern that served us both for a while, and then gradually served neither of us. Though it took years before either of us understood that. By 2009, I had applied for and been accepted to Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island. I was commissioned as an ensign 01 in the fall of that year. I called my mother. I called Mateo, who was 17 and would start his senior year of high school the following week. I told him what commissioning meant. He listened. He said, "So you're going to be in charge of people?" I said yes. He said, "Okay, that makes sense." That was the whole conversation. The bus to Newport left on a Tuesday morning in September. Mateo came. He was taller than me now, in the jacket I had bought him for his birthday. We stood on the sidewalk. I hugged my mother and then him. He stood a little stiffly. He was at the age where physical affection required composure, but he did not let go fast. The bus pulled out. I looked back once. He had raised one hand. I faced forward and went to work. I had no idea yet what the distance I was beginning to create would eventually cost. The first real warning came in the form of a text message. It was not the only warning. There were earlier signals I had filed and told myself were just life. But the text message is the one I keep coming back to, because by the time it arrived, I had enough information to understand what it meant. I chose not to press on it. I set my phone face down and went back to work. That choice belongs to me. The year was 2017. I was 30 years old. I had just pinned on Commander 05 in the United States Navy, and it was the most significant professional milestone in my career. In the intelligence and special operations world, commander means something specific. You carry planning authority, you are trusted with consequence, you are in rooms where the decisions made affect people who are going downrange. My chain of command understood what I had built. Captain Marcus Briggs, 06, who had just become my direct superior at Naval Special Warfare, shook my hand with both of his and said, "You've earned this." Mateo's text arrived 2 days later. He was 25 years old. It read, "Hey, Mom said, nice one. Nice one." 2 days, 2 words, 1 period. I read it twice. I thought, that's not nothing. But it wasn't much. Let me account for the years between 2009 and 2017 fairly. The progression: ensign in 2009, lieutenant junior grade in 2010, lieutenant in 2012, lieutenant commander in 2015, commander in 2017. Each rank came with a new assignment, new demands. By 2015, I had completed 2 combat zone deployments, Bagram in 2012 with a joint intelligence support element, and a Gulf rotation in 2013. By 2014, I was back stateside, selected for a billet at Naval Special Warfare Group 2 in Virginia Beach. That assignment was the beginning of my serious work adjacent to DevGru mission coordination, and it was the assignment that made me, professionally, the person I am now. It was also the assignment that began to make me someone genuinely difficult to explain to people outside of it. I kept sending money to Mateo through those years, not constantly, but regularly, whenever I sensed from my mother that he was running short somewhere. He worked construction in San Antonio for a period, then moved to Corpus Christi for a job that lasted 8 months, then came back to San Antonio. He was good with his hands and good at reading a work site, but the opportunities were inconsistent, and the pay reflected that. I sent what I could without making it a discussion. My mother was the relay. "Mateo got your check." He said thanks. I said, "He doesn't have to." That was the entire exchange, every time. After a while, I stopped waiting for anything different and accepted that this was the language we had found for care between us. Money sent without fanfare. Acknowledgement passed through a third party, neither of us pushing on the parts of the arrangement that might not hold up to direct examination. In 2015, Mateo met Priya Krishnamurthy. She was an architectural designer, precise, warm, capable of making people feel seen without appearing to try. Her family was stable and educated in the way of people who have never had to calculate whether a necessary thing was also affordable. I was genuinely glad for him. He deserved someone who saw him clearly. What I did not fully account for was that Priya's world, the life they were building together, had no natural slot for a sister who was always somewhere classified and never quite able to explain the specifics. He wasn't embarrassed by me. I don't think it was that. I think he just didn't have the words for what I did. And after a while, I wasn't sure he wanted them. The Nenstas Group 2 billet was the most consequential professional step I had taken since commissioning. I was 27 when I arrived and 28 when I was promoted to lieutenant commander. I was working in rooms where the decisions had direct operational consequences for the people going downrange, and I was good at it in the specific way that matters in those rooms: precise, reliable under pressure, fast without being careless. My evaluations reflected it. My chain of command trusted it. Briggs, before he became my direct superior, knew my name and my work before he ever sat across a table from me, which in those circles is a particular kind of recognition. When I called my mother to tell her about the NS billet, the first thing she asked was whether I'd be home for Mateo's birthday in February. I checked my calendar. I was in the middle of a planning cycle. I sent a gift. Mateo sent a 1-line text acknowledging it, then went radio silent for 3 months. When we finally spoke again, he mentioned in passing that Priya's brother had asked what his sister did. Mateo had told him I was in the Navy. Not DevGru coordination, not JSOC adjacent, not Special Operations Command. Just in the Navy. He wasn't lying. He was using the words he had available. But the reduction of it sat somewhere in me that I didn't fully examine at the time. I filed it. I told myself it was just shorthand, that he couldn't be expected to know the terminology, that it wasn't really a reflection of anything larger. That story was easier than the alternative. The alternative was that the gap between us had become, without either of us deciding it consciously, the default. 2015 brought his engagement to Priya. 2016 I spent deep in my second year at NS Group 2, expanding my role in operational mission coordination, pulling longer hours, building the kind of institutional knowledge that takes years to develop and can't be transferred in a briefing. I was 39 years old inside my work, in the sense of how much time it consumed. I was a peripheral figure in Mateo's life, checking in at holidays and relaying news through our mother and sending money when the situation seemed to call for it. He did not call me when he got engaged, and my mother told me about it. That registered somewhere I also filed away. 2017, I pinned on commander at a small ceremony attended by my colleagues and my chain of command. Briggs shook my hand with both of his and told me I'd earned it, which is not something he said carelessly. My colleagues made a small fuss. Someone brought a cake. I took a photograph with the citation and sent it to my mother, who sent it on to Mateo. He replied 2 days later, "Hey, Mom said, nice one." I read it twice. I set my phone face down on the desk. I went back to the planning document in front of me because that was the thing in the room I could actually affect. Nice one. That was it. 2 days, 2 words, 1 period. I remember thinking, that's not nothing, but it wasn't much. And I knew, in the way that you know things you're not quite ready to look at directly, that the distance between us had become something I was going to have to address eventually. I just didn't know yet what addressing it would cost or what it would look like, or that it would take another 8 years and a bar near Dam Neck and a phone call that went out on speaker to make it happen. The years between 2017 and 2025 move the way the years of hard work move when you are deep inside them, with the compressed, eventful pace of people who are always carrying more than they're showing. Mateo married Priya in 2018, a civil ceremony that I attended, and which was a genuinely good day. He had a daughter in 2020, Lucia, whom I met when she was 4 months old. A son in 2022, Tomas, for whom I sent a card and did not call. By 2024, I learned through my mother that Priya was pregnant again, and Mateo called me out of the blue to tell me they were planning a formal ceremony, a proper wedding, for Priya's family, and would I come? I said yes. He said, good. That was the end of the call. Somewhere in the quiet after that call ended, I understood that we had arrived at a place I had not intended. The gap was not a gap anymore. It was a habit. And habits, unlike gaps, don't close on their own. They require a decision, and then the work that follows a decision, and then the patience to let that work proceed at the pace it needs. I didn't know yet that the decision was going to arrive in a bar near Dam Neck at 7:03 on a Friday evening in May of 2025. By way of a phone call, I answered on speaker because my hands were full. But that's where it started. That's where everything that follows started. I arrived at the bar at 6:45 on a Friday evening in May of 2025. I was 38 years old. I had been a commander for 8 years, and I had spent 6 of those 8 years in planning rooms that most people will never have clearance to know exist. Mateo had asked me to meet him there before his rehearsal dinner, said there were things he wanted to talk about before the wedding, things he needed to get out before the ceremony turned everything into an occasion. I said yes. I arrived early because I am always early. That is not discipline anymore. It is just how I move through the world. The bar was a neighborhood place near Dam Neck, dim, wood-paneled, the kind of establishment that has been in the same location for decades because its clientele has not changed, and it has not needed to change with them. It was a working military neighborhood bar, the kind where regulars don't look up when the door opens because if you're walking in, you probably belong here. I wore jeans and a leather jacket, no insignia. I keep a low profile when I'm off duty. I have been in this world long enough to know that authority doesn't require announcement and that the people who announce it loudest are usually the ones who have the least of it. I took a stool at the bar. The man behind it was compact and gray-templed and somewhere in his early 50s, carrying himself with the kind of postural economy that comes from years in uniform. The way certain men stand that says they've stood at attention enough times that their body has simply kept the habit. I didn't recognize him from across the room in the low light, and he said nothing beyond asking what I wanted. I ordered a whiskey neat. He poured it and moved away. 2 men were 2 stools down from me, both late 20s, both built in the way that men who do very hard physical work are built, dense across the shoulders, economical in their movements, comfortable in a way that said they were regulars here and they knew exactly where they stood in this neighborhood. They were several beers into their evening. I registered all of this in roughly the time it takes to sit down, because that is how I have learned to read a room, and I did not make the reading obvious. The taller one spoke up almost immediately. He said it loud enough to be heard, loud enough to perform. "You lost, little lady?" The second one chuckled into his beer. He said, "Bachelorette parties that way." I've been hearing some version of that question since 2005. I heard it at Great Lakes during boot camp from 2 male recruits who made a calculation about me in the first 30 seconds that turned out to be wrong. I heard versions of it at A School, on deployment, in the corridors of Naval Station Norfolk, at Bagram, at Anastasiolis Group 2, in every professional environment I have ever occupied where someone decided that my presence there required an explanation. I did not answer it in 2005, and I was not going to start answering it now. I picked up my whiskey. I thought about Mateo, about what he wanted to talk about, whether he was ready for whatever he'd decided to say, whether I was ready to hear it. The bartender across the bar made a small expression that registered and then disappeared. I caught it. I let the whole thing slide and faced straight ahead. My secure phone rang at 7:03. I was reaching for my wallet when it rang. I answered on speaker without thinking, both hands occupied, reflex. Captain Marcus Briggs's voice came through the bar flat and professional and entirely clear. "Commander, DevGru needs your green light on tonight's op. We're holding for your call." The bar went dead quiet. I had been tracking that mission package for the entire week. I knew its components, the personnel involved, the timeline, the risk picture, and the contingency structure. I knew the answer before Briggs had finished the sentence. I authorized the package, 2 sentences, exact, without theater or hesitation. I ended the call. I set the phone down on the bar. The taller SEAL had set his beer down so carefully it didn't make a sound. I noticed that specifically, the deliberateness of it, the controlled precision of a man who is suddenly very aware of every movement he's making. The second one was looking at the surface of the bar. Neither of them was looking at me. I turned on my stool. I looked at them, not with contempt. Contempt would have been a waste of the moment, and the moment didn't need my contempt to land. What I felt was closer to professional patience, the particular patience that develops over years of managing rooms where someone has said or done something that requires correction, and you have learned that the correction lands harder when you deliver it without heat. I looked at them and then I looked at the bartender. The gray-templed, compact man behind the bar was standing at parade rest, back straight, hands clasped, chin level, with a half-smile on his face. He had recognized me the moment I walked through the door. I understood that now with complete clarity. He had poured my drink, moved away, and said absolutely nothing. He had waited. Later I would learn his name was Hector Dominguez. Senior Chief Petty Officer, E8, Retired Naval Special Warfare. He had served at SEAL Team 4 and Dam Neck. He knew exactly who I was. He had understood, the moment he saw me sit down, that the 2 men, 2 stools over, were going to make a decision they'd regret, and he had decided to let the situation take care of itself, which it did. I asked him to pour 2 more beers. He poured without comment. I slid them down the bar. I looked at the 2 younger men and said, "Sit up straight. The next stranger you try to chase off a bar stool might be the one signing your deployment orders." The taller one started to say something. "Commander, we didn't." I turned back to my drink. The lesson had arrived by way of the phone call. I had not manufactured it or sought it out. It simply rang. The contrast between their posturing and the flat professional reality of that call had done all the work that needed doing. He didn't need to finish the sentence, and I didn't need to hear the rest of it. We were past that point. The door opened 2 minutes later. Mateo came in wearing a collared shirt and an open jacket, and the expression of a man who had come straight from something else and hadn't quite landed in the present yet. He was 32 years old, capable, and a little tired in the particular way that adults who have taken on real weight in their lives are tired, not defeated, just carrying. He pushed open the door and stopped. He read the room. I watched him do it. He didn't know the details. He didn't know what DevGru was, or who Briggs was, or what the phone call had been about. But he understood the shape of what he was looking at. 2 men sitting perfectly still, a bartender standing at parade rest with a knowing expression, and his sister at the center of a quiet she had not manufactured and was not managing. He stood in the doorway and took it in, and then he walked to the stool beside mine and sat down. He didn't say anything for a long moment. I didn't either. The bar was still quiet. Dominguez had moved to the far end of the counter. The 2 younger SEALs were looking at their drinks. Then Mateo said quietly, "Mom never told me you were in charge of them." "I'm not in charge of them," I said. "I just approved something they'll be working on later tonight." He was quiet for a long while after that. He didn't ask what the thing was. He didn't push on any part of the answer. He just sat with it. And for the first time in 8 years, the silence between my brother and me was not a wall. It was a room we were both in, with a door open and enough light coming through that we could finally see where we were. And we stayed at the bar for just over an hour after Mateo sat down. The 2 younger SEALs, Schultz and Navarro, though I had not learned their names yet and didn't particularly need to, left quietly somewhere around 8:15. There was no ceremony to their departure, no further conversation, just the particular dignity of men who have been corrected and have decided to absorb it without making it worse. Senior Chief Dominguez moved to the far end of the bar and found reasons to stay there. He had the instincts of a man who knew exactly when to give a situation space and exactly how much space to give it. Mateo ordered a beer. He held it without drinking for a while. The silence between us was not uncomfortable, which was itself notable. The silences between us in recent years have been the kind that contain everything neither person is willing to name, weighted, slightly pressurized, with the quality of a conversation that has been deferred past the point of easy entry. This silence was different. It had some air in it. He said eventually, "I didn't know what you actually do. I knew you were in the Navy. I knew it mattered somehow, but I didn't know. I didn't defend myself." There is a version of this conversation where I walk through the classification levels and the access restrictions and the legitimate institutional reasons why I could not have given him a detailed account of my work. That version is true. It is also a way of evading the thing that was actually my failure, which was simpler than that. I had stopped trying, not because the work was classified, because explaining it was hard, and eventually I had told myself he wouldn't understand anyway. And the story I told myself became its own kind of wall between us. "I know," I said. I couldn't explain it in a way that made sense, and after a while I stopped trying. He told me about the life he had been building, about Priya's family, about the world they had made together over the last several years, the warmth of it and the coherence of it and the way it had become, without his quite noticing, the primary place he belonged. He described feeling, over time, like there wasn't a slot in that world for a sister who was always somewhere she couldn't talk about. He wasn't accusing me. He was describing the view from where he had been standing, and the view from where he had been standing was accurate. He had built a complete life, and I had not been in it in any real sense, and that was a fact that belonged to both of us. He wasn't wrong about any of it. That was the hard part. I had been absent. The reasons were real, but reasons and presence aren't the same thing. "I should have tried harder to tell you what I could," I said. It was the most direct statement I had made to him in years. We finished our drinks. He hugged me in the parking lot, a real one, the kind that lasts more than the socially expected length, the kind that says something that words would make smaller. He told me he'd see me at the rehearsal dinner the next day. I watched him drive out of the parking lot, and then I sat in my own car without starting it. I ran through the last 18 years with the thoroughness of an after-action review. I am not built for wallowing, but I am built for accounting, and there is a difference. Wallowing circles. Accounting takes stock. I took stock. What I had given, the money sent without asking for acknowledgement, the leave periods spent attempting to maintain contact when he wasn't reaching back. The calls I had made that went unreturned, the attempts to show up at the occasions that mattered to him, the steady effort across 18 years to remain in his life, even as the content of my life became increasingly impossible to share. What he had given back. The 2-day text when I made commander, the years of rooting contact through our mother, the reduction of my career to the phrase, "She's in the Navy," the birthday where I didn't come, and the follow-up silence that lasted 3 months. What I had gotten right, I kept coming back. I always came back. I showed up at his civil ceremony in 2018 and stayed for the whole thing and meant it. I never stopped being his sister in the ways that were within my control to continue. By the time I started the car, I had not resolved anything, but I had named it. Naming things is not a resolution. It is just the beginning of the work that might lead there. I didn't blame him. I didn't blame myself exactly. What I did was tally it up, the way you do after something goes wrong, so you know exactly what you're working with. Captain Briggs called at 7:32 the next morning to confirm the op had gone clean. It had. After the official exchange, there was a pause, and he said, "You answered on speaker at a bar. That's not like you." I told him about Mateo. Not all of it. Enough of it. The rehearsal dinner, the years of distance, the way the phone call had landed in a room where my brother happened to walk in 2 minutes later and saw something he had needed to see for a long time. Briggs was quiet in the way he goes quiet when he's formulating something that matters to him. Then he said, "I've got a brother who doesn't know what I do either." At some point, you stop expecting them to understand and start just being glad they're still calling. "He wasn't calling," I said. "That was the problem." "Is he now?" I thought about it for a moment. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe he is." It was the most honest answer I had. And it was enough for Briggs, who understood that maybe, in the context of this particular kind of long silence, was actually a significant distance from where things had been. I got dressed for the rehearsal dinner carefully. Not my uniform, not the leather jacket I'd been wearing the night before. Something deliberate and civilian, the kind of thing you wear when you want to be entirely present without making the presence itself the point. I stood at the mirror for longer than I usually allow myself. I was deciding something, though I didn't name the decision out loud even to myself. I picked up the framed promotion citation from the dresser, not to take it, just to hold it for a moment, to feel the weight of what it represented. Then I set it down and left. I didn't need him to know the classified parts, I just needed him to know there were classified parts, that I hadn't been absent because I didn't care. I had been absent because the work was real and it required what it required, and that is different from simply not showing up. There is a difference. It's not a perfect difference, but it is real, and it mattered to me to have him understand it. The door clicked shut behind me. The promotion citation was on the dresser, just visible through the narrowing gap as I pulled the door closed. Then the latch caught, and I walked out into the May morning and went to meet my family at a restaurant in Virginia Beach, where someone who had been in the Navy for 18 years was going to spend an evening being, finally, exactly who she was. The restaurant had a private room in the back, a long table, good lighting, the kind of space that manages to feel both warm and unfussy. The sort of place that doesn't try to be more than it is, which is exactly what a rehearsal dinner needs when the people at the table are still figuring out who they all are to each other. I arrived 6 minutes early. Mateo was already there, standing near the entrance in a jacket that looked like he'd pressed it that afternoon. He saw me come through the door, and he came over and took my coat and said, "There's someone I want you to meet." He walked me across the room to where Priya's father was standing with a glass of water and the upright posture of a man who has spent a long career applying precision to problems. Rajan Krishnamurthy was 60 years old, a retired civil engineer, and he had the particular kind of sharp warmth that belongs to people who have spent their lives building things and know exactly how long things take and what they cost. He extended his hand, and Mateo said, "This is my sister, Amanda." He paused. Then, without hesitation, "She's a commander in the Navy. She works at the Special Operations Command." 8 years. That was the first time he had said it out loud to someone who didn't already know. I shook Rajan's hand. I said, "Pleased to meet you." That was all. The moment did not need anything added to it. Priya's mother, Sunita Krishnamurthy, 57, a former school administrator, warm and precise in her own way, was nearby and introduced herself with a handshake that lasted exactly the right length. Priya herself came over a moment later and hugged me and said simply, "I'm glad you're here." She meant it. I could tell she meant it. Priya is not the kind of person who says things she doesn't mean. My mother, Diane, was already seated when I found the table. She reached up and squeezed my hand without making anything of it, which was exactly right. The dinner moved the way these evenings move when the people at the table are genuinely making an effort. Conversations finding their footing, the early stiffness giving way to something easier as the food arrived and the wine was poured, and the accumulated effort of goodwill began to produce actual warmth. I talked with Rajan about Virginia Beach, about the engineering challenges of coastal construction, about the difference between building things in high wind environments versus high humidity ones. He was interested in the details of things, which I appreciated. He did not talk around subjects. Somewhere between the salad course and the main course, he turned the conversation to my work. He asked what my role involved. I gave the answer I have learned to calibrate, joint planning, intelligence coordination, and support to special operations. Accurate, appropriately general. He listened the way engineers listen, which is to say, without interrupting and without pretending to understand the parts he didn't. He said his nephew had been a surface warfare officer, a different world, but he had some general frame of reference. He asked how long I had been serving. 18 years, I said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Mateo across the table. He said, "Your sister has been serving this country since before you were in high school." Mateo looked at his plate. He said, "I know." It was the first time someone outside the military had said it to him in those exact terms. I did not add anything to it. I did not turn to look at Mateo or give the moment any shape beyond what Rajan had already given it. I ate my dinner. The thing that needed to land had landed, and it didn't need me to manage it. Later, in a hallway near the back of the restaurant, my mother found me. She walked over without any preamble and put her arms around me the way she used to when I was small and something had been hard, both arms, fully committed, for longer than is strictly social. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright. She said, "He told me about last night, at the bar." "It wasn't a big deal," I said. "It was to him," she said. She took my face in her hands the way she used to when I was 12 years old, and she needed me to really hear something, both hands steady and looking straight at me. I should have pushed him harder to understand. All those years. "Mom," I said, "you were working doubles, you were keeping the house running, that's what you did." She laughed a little, the kind that has something else in it, something older. "I know," she said, "but still." "Let's go back in," I said. At the end of the evening, Mateo walked me to my car. It was cool for May, the kind of night that Virginia Beach does occasionally, clear and dry and quiet. He walked with his hands in his jacket pockets. He said, "I want you at the wedding." "I'll be there," I said. "I mean at the front," he said, "not sitting in the back being invisible." "I know." He stopped walking. He said, "I didn't know who you were. I thought I did for years, but I was wrong. I was working with an old version of you that I never updated." I opened my car door. I didn't make a speech. There was nothing in me at that moment that wanted to make a speech, and he didn't need one. He needed what he'd already gotten and what was coming. I said, "Let's fix that." And then I got in the car and I pulled out of the parking lot, and through the restaurant window behind me, I couldn't see it, but I knew it was true. He was standing at the glass, watching my taillights until they disappeared. The drive home was quiet. I didn't run an after-action review. I had done that the night before in the parking lot of the bar, and the accounting was complete. What this evening had added to it was simpler and harder to describe. The specific experience of being introduced correctly, fully, by name and rank and role, by the person whose opinion of who I was had mattered to me since he was 7 years old and I was 12. Riding alongside him on a cracked Abilene sidewalk with one hand on the back of his bicycle seat. He was correcting an old error. That's what it was. Not dramatically, not with excessive ceremony, just quietly and directly, the way you correct something when you understand you got it wrong and want to not have it wrong anymore. I didn't need him to explain it, I just needed him to do it. And he did. I walked into my apartment, set my keys on the table, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The promotion citation was on the dresser in the next room where I had left it that morning. I did not look at it. I had looked at it this morning. Tonight I just stood in the kitchen for a moment and let the day be over. Something had shifted. Not everything, not all at once. But the first domino, which is always the hardest one because it carries all the weight of the ones that haven't moved yet, that one had finally gone over. The week after the rehearsal dinner, Mateo called me on a Tuesday morning. Not to relay a message from our mother, not to ask for anything, not on an occasion that would have made the call expected. He called because he had a question, and I was the person he needed to ask. That was new. That was different in a way. I did not make the mistake of overstating to myself, but that I also did not understate. I was at my desk in the JSOC staff building, reviewing a planning document and a cup of coffee I had made an hour earlier and not quite finished. I pushed back from the desk when I saw his name, and I answered. He said he wanted to ask me something, but wasn't sure how. I told him to just ask. He said, "When you're working, those operations, people could die if you get it wrong, right?" I said yes. He was quiet. Then, "How do you do that every day?" I said, "The same way you manage a job site. You know the plan. You know your people. You make the call and then you trust the work." He said, "That's not the same thing." "It's more similar than you think," I said. He wasn't asking to upset me. He wasn't asking to test me or to challenge the legitimacy of the comparison. He was asking because he finally needed to know. There's a specific difference between those two things, and the difference mattered. He was doing the work of trying to understand, imperfectly and earnestly, without a map. Amanda meeting him where he was, instead of where she needed him to be, was also something new. 3 weeks into June, the calls stopped again. I did not press. I have managed enough sustained operations to understand that progress does not move in a straight line, and that people who are in the process of changing do not change on a schedule that corresponds to anyone's preference, including their own. I recognized his silence as processing. I treated it as processing. That was itself a change from the version of me who might have registered a 3-week silence as confirmation of something she had been half expecting. I went for a run along Dam Neck Beach one morning in early June and took a photograph of the water, silver and flat in the low light, the horizon perfectly straight. I sent it to Mateo with no caption. He replied 2 hours later with a thumbs up. That evening, a second message. Priya wants to know if you can come to dinner next month. I answered yes. That was the whole exchange. But it meant something different than an identical exchange would have meant 6 months earlier. The same words, a different underlying condition. Progress is often like that. The surface looks similar. The structure underneath has changed. Changing takes time. I know that better than most. You don't demand it on a timeline. You create the conditions for it and then you wait. In July, Priya called. I was on the highway heading back from the base on a Thursday afternoon and her name came up on the display. I answered. She said, I want to apologize. I said, for what? She said, for letting Mateo minimize you. I could have said something earlier, many times earlier, and I didn't. My family loves you already. They've loved you since the rehearsal dinner, and I should have found a way to make that clear to him sooner than I did. I was quiet for a moment, watching the highway, thinking about what she'd said and whether it was accurate and what the right response was. Then I said, you didn't minimize me. He was making sense of something he didn't have the vocabulary for. That's not the same thing. I know, she said, but I saw it happening and I didn't push back. That's on me. Priya, I said, you're good for him. The fact that you're making this call is evidence of that. That counts for something. She was quiet. Then, just come to the wedding, not in the back. I'll be at the front, I said. By late July, we were running at full operational tempo, the kind of planning cycle that moves without gaps for weeks at a stretch, the kind I am built for and that I do my best work inside. There's something clarifying about full commitment to a complex task. The noise recedes, the essential things sharpen. Briggs observed me in a planning session one afternoon in late July and afterward pulled me aside in the corridor and said, you're in a different gear. Nothing's changed, I said. Something's changed, he said. I didn't answer that, but he was right and I knew what he was pointing at. There was something that had been sitting on me, not at the surface, not in any way that announced itself or disrupted the work, but deeper, in the background, the low-level static of a thing unresolved. When it lifted, the work got lighter. Not because the work had changed, but because I was doing it without carrying something I had stopped noticing I was carrying. He wasn't wrong. Something had been sitting on me for years that I'd stopped noticing was there. When it lifted, I noticed. The operational cycle ran through most of August and then wound down in the way that cycles do when the primary objectives are complete and the planning transitions into review. The work did not stop. The work at NLAs never stops entirely. But the tempo dropped enough that I found I had a Sunday free in late August that didn't have anything required in it. I spent part of it on a run and part of it at my kitchen table going through correspondence I had let accumulate, and part of it on the phone with Diane, who told me that Mateo had been asking about me, which was not something I was accustomed to hearing. He called himself that evening. He asked if I had plans the following Sunday. I said I didn't. He said, come to Chesapeake. Priya's making dinner. I said I would. He said, Lucia's been asking when Tia Amanda is coming. It was the first time I had heard him use that word. Not my sister or just Amanda, but Tia. The word Lucia used. The word that meant I existed in that household with a specific shape and name and function. I said, tell her soon. The weeks between the bar and that Sunday dinner had not been a smooth arc. There were good days and quieter days. There were moments of genuine forward movement and stretches that felt like standing still. That is the actual texture of repair, not a montage, not a steady rise, but the real and uneven thing that happens when two people have decided to try without knowing exactly what trying looks like from here. What I knew was that the effort was real on both sides, that Mateo was doing something he had not done before, asking instead of assuming, calling instead of waiting, that Priya was doing something generous and specific, that my mother was watching all of it with the quiet relief of a woman who had been holding two separate sides of a torn thing for years and could feel finally that they were being brought back into proximity. And I knew that I was doing something I had not always done, which was letting it happen at the pace it needed to happen. Not pressing, not requiring a particular shape, not organizing the repair as though it were a planning problem I could solve with sufficient preparation. Just showing up, creating the conditions, waiting. Which is its own kind of work and harder than it sounds for someone who has spent 18 years in a world where action is the answer to everything. There are things you carry for so long that you stop registering the weight. That's the part nobody tells you. You just walk around with it, year after year, and call it normal. I drove to Chesapeake on a Sunday in late August, the first time I had ever been to my brother Mateo's house. I brought flowers. I had no plan beyond the flowers. The door opened, and a 5-year-old in a yellow dress looked up at me and said, "Are you my tia Amanda?" I said yes. She grabbed my hand and pulled me inside, and that was that. No ceremony, no formal accounting of the years I had missed. Just a small hand in mine, and a kitchen that smelled like dinner, and the particular noise of a family that had been going on without me and was, without complaint, making room. I sat at that table and did nothing useful. I didn't organize anything or monitor the room or look for ways to be necessary. I just ate the food Priya had made and let the noise of a functioning family wash over me. And it was the most consequential meal I had eaten in years. Later, after the children were in bed and my mother had driven home, Mateo came out to the back porch with 2 beers and sat across from me in the dark. He didn't build to it. He just asked, "Did I hurt you? All those years, did I actually hurt you?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said yes. He said he hadn't known he was doing it. I said I knew. He said he should have asked what my life looked like instead of assuming the absence was the whole story. I said I should have insisted on telling him what I could. We sat with that. Neither of us needed to argue the proportions. The thing had been said, without deflection, for the first time, and that was the work. Priya told me later, at the kitchen sink, that he had talked about me every time I deployed. Every single time. He just didn't know how to say it to my face. She said he was better at guilt than he was at phone calls. I almost laughed. She thanked me for not holding it against him permanently. I told her I didn't do it for him, I did it for Lucia, and maybe a little for myself. I drove home with the radio on, which I almost never do. I didn't try to analyze anything, I just drove. That was new. October arrived, and with it, a Thursday morning when Briggs called me into his office and told me my name was on the '06 screening list for the next promotion cycle. Not a promise, he said, just awareness. I asked what it meant for my current billet. He said it was too early to know. I said I wasn't sure I was done here yet. He said that was a good answer, that people who couldn't wait to leave usually shouldn't be promoted. I went back to my desk and sat with the strange feeling of looking at a horizon I had been running toward for 18 years, and not being entirely certain anymore whether I was still running or had simply stopped bracing. That same evening, Mateo called while I was making dinner. He called to tell me that Thomas had said Tia for the first time, pointing at a photograph on the refrigerator. He called to tell me that Lucia had announced she was going to join the Navy because Tia Amanda does it and Tia Amanda is important. I laughed, a real one, unprepared. I told him to tell her she'd need to be good at math. He said she already was. She got it from Priya. The call lasted 11 minutes and I was still smiling when I hung up. I noticed it because it wasn't common. I made a note of it the way I make notes of things that matter. In November, I took a full Sunday off. No work, no reviews, and ran for an hour at Dam Neck Beach in the cold, and then sat on driftwood at the edge of the water and thought about the year without trying to make it into a product. The bar in May, Mateo's face in the doorway, the rehearsal dinner, and the first time he said my rank out loud to someone who didn't know. The August porch, and the honest question, and the honest answer. Lucia at the front door. The Tuesday call is about nothing important. None of it was formally resolved. All of it was real. And I understood, sitting there in the cold, that I had been waiting for some official moment of completion, for the chapter to announce itself closed. But life doesn't issue those. The chapter turns. You just keep walking. I started writing Mateo a message that evening, 3 sentences about the year, about the distance we'd crossed, about the gratitude I couldn't quite size correctly. I read it. I deleted it. I sent instead, "You around this weekend?" He replied in 4 minutes. "Yeah? Come for dinner Saturday?" Everything I needed to say was in the draft. Everything that mattered was in the reply. The water at Dam Neck that morning was gray and flat, the horizon perfectly straight. I wasn't moving, But I wasn't bracing either. That was the difference. The bracing had been there for so long, I hadn't recognized it as a posture. The distance had closed, the chapter had turned. And standing at the edge of the Atlantic in November, with the cold coming off the water and the year finally making sense behind me, I was just standing there. Which is, it turns out, enough. Sometimes that's the whole thing, standing somewhere without the weight of what you were carrying before, with the road ahead still lit and the next dinner still to come. If this story hit home, remember this. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see our sacrifices until we finally stop making ourselves small. Have you ever felt invisible to someone you kept showing up for? Would you have forgiven Mateo, or would you have walked away for good? And do you think Amanda waited too long to stand up for herself? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you've ever had to reclaim your worth after being overlooked, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories about family, betrayal, boundaries, and second chances.